Hello, all, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jody Kent Levy, and I'm the co executive director of the CFSY. We are so happy to have you with us today, and I'm so excited to introduce you to two truly extraordinary leaders in our movement, two dear friends, and two people who have profoundly shaped my own understanding of racial justice, for which I'm deeply grateful. As you likely know, Clint recently published a widely acclaimed nonfiction narrative book, How the Word is Passed, which offers an intergenerational story of how slavery has shaped our nation's collective history and ourselves. If you haven't yet read it, be sure to get yourself a copy or listen to Clint read it on the audiobook, which is so great. They're both so great, and it's absolutely essential reading for all Americans. Clint will be in conversation with one of my personal heroes, Abd'Allah Lateef. In spite of being condemned to life without parole at the age of 17 and serving more than 30 years in prison, Abd'Allah has become a respected thought leader, a trailblazing advocate, mentor, and religious instructor. Abd'Allah serves on the board of several nonprofits, including the Juvenile Law Center, and we are privileged to have him in a leadership role on the CFSY staff. Before we begin, I just want to pause to thank our generous sponsors who helped ensure this event could be free and open to the public. They're listed on our event page, so check that out. Also, as a heads up, today's conversation will be recorded, and Clint and Abd'Allah may have time to answer a few questions at the end, so if you have any, please feel free to drop them in the chat as we go. I can't wait to listen to them in conversation today, and I encourage you to join me in giving them a very warm welcome. I'll turn it over to you, Clint.
It's so good to be here with my friend Abd'Allah. It's been, I think I met Abd'Allah in 2018. I think when I was a lowly graduate student, and I was trying to figure out how to write this thing called a dissertation. And for those who don't know, my dissertation was separate. It's a different thing than the book. I wrote a dissertation in the book at the same time, which I don't recommend. But it was on how children sentenced to life without parole make meaning of the purpose of education while they are incarcerated. And Abd'Allah was, instrumental in helping me think through these questions and helping me find people to speak to. And, I remember the first time we sat down in a coffee shop in Philadelphia, and I think we sat down in Qdoba the first time and a coffee shop the second time. And it was like 4 hours of amazing, enriching conversation. And I was like, man, if all of them sound like Abd'Allah, like it's gonna be the dissertation of the century. So I'm incredibly grateful to be here with you. How are you doing?
Oh, wow, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Welcome and thank you all for joining us in this momentous occasion. And indeed, I remember meeting you for the first time as if it was yesterday, on a sunny day, not unlike it is today. And I just appreciated just the curiosity, the warmth, the generosity of spirit that animated the meeting between us. And the second time, obviously, took us into a 4-hour conversation. Today won't be that, unfortunately. Nonetheless, certainly look to having a written dialogue and sharing thoughts. But yeah, doing well. Hopefully you are doing well, family doing well. Understand that there's been additions to the family since the last time we've met. So it's only appropriate that we acknowledge and bring that degree of love into the conversation as well, because it is a family affair. So how's family?
Everybody's well. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we were talking before how they're back in preschool now, which means that we are a house full of coughs and runny noses and snot everywhere. Mm. So I'm taking Zicam left and right to try. I'm like, don't let that get to me. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. So it's everybody, this is what preschool is. So lots of songs, lots of poop jokes, and lots of runny noses.
Indeed. And so your book, what can I say about your book? Phenomenal book. it's an overused phrase, but one that is certainly appropriate in this instance, that it is a must read, rich in content experience. And in some ways I found it instructive. And so while we are in this era where we're grappling with truth-telling, liberation, social transformation, your book checks the box in each of those categories in the way that you tell truth, geared towards liberation. And I think that liberation is both liberation of self from misconceptions, notions, and ideas, especially around Blackness and our presence here in America. And then the invitation towards a social transformation, both in terms of our concepts and our ideas, but also in the way that we show up for one another. And so if you don't mind, I would actually, although this is not necessarily about your book is so important, I think that it should in some ways inform the conversation. And so what I would like to do, if you don't mind, is to just bring up a reflection that you had early on in the book. When you were speaking about, and this is hearkening to your love of poetry as well. I don't think we mentioned in the introduction that you're also an accomplished poet, and we may have a particular treat towards the end of this conversation. However, in the book, you spoke and you made reference to Phyllis Wheatley and Thomas Jefferson, who was obviously a very complicated figure, who you dissect in your book, and getting into some of those complicated ideas around his persona. And one of the things that struck out to me is where he speaks in reference to Phyllis's poetry, where he makes this statement that love is a peculiar ostrum of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination. And you say that as you were exploring this narrative, this thought, you were yourself in the midst of writing your own poetry. And can you give us some reflections of what that meant, or should I go on and just to read a small portion of your book, and then we'll come back and get your reflections? So you said, when I read Jefferson's disparagement of Wheatley, it felt like he had been disparaging the entire lineage of Black poets who would follow her, myself included. And I saw a man who had not had a clear understanding of what love is. When Robert Hayden gave us the ballads to remember how captured Africans survived the Middle Passage and arrived on these shores, it was an act of love. When Glendolyn Brooks wrote about the children of the South Side of Chicago playing with one another in neighborhoods left neglected by the city, it was an act of love. When Audre Lorde fractured the language and then built us a new one, giving us a fresh way to make sense of who we are in the world, it was an act of love. When Sonia Sanchez makes lightning of her tongue, moving from Southern colloquialisms to stanzas shaped by Swahili, traversing an ocean in one breath, it was an act of love. Jefferson's conception of love seemed to have been so distorted by his own prejudice that he was unable to recognize the endless examples of love that pervaded plantations across the country. Mothers who huddled over their children and took the lash so their little ones wouldn't have to. Surrogate mothers, fathers, and grandparents who took in children and raised them as their own when their biological parents were disappeared in the middle of the night. The people who loved and married and committed to one another despite the omnipresent threat that they might be separated at any moment. What is this if not an act of love? And so your book, again, to me, was a reflection and was an act of love. And it is said that in the way that tenderness is what love looks like in private, justice is what love looks like in public.
Mm.
So as we embark upon this conversation, a conversation that's rooted in love, how do you feel about the era that we are in, about what we witness and the emotion that poured out in your book, and even the disparaging remarks
Mm.
that traverse history
Yeah,
that still informs your Blackness today?
yeah, thank you for that. It's not often that someone else reads your words to you. I'm so used to reading them myself. It was a real treat to hear you, to hear it rendered through your voice. So thank you for that. I think what might be helpful is if I give a little bit more context for those who might be unfamiliar with the book, a bit more context, and then speak to more directly what you were alluding to. So my book, How the Word is Passed, is about how different places across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. And it began when I saw these statues of several Confederate leaders be taken down in my hometown of New Orleans in May of 2017. So statues of Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, these generals and president of the Confederacy. And I was watching these statues come down from my home here in Maryland and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. And my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy, that my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions and implications for people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it is to say that all of these things are part of an ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help us understand what has happened throughout the history of this country, what specific types of harm has been enacted on different communities in this country, and thus more effectively enable us to look around and understand what sort of amends and repairs need to be made to the communities that have been harmed. And so I started thinking about what that reckoning looked like in the context of my own hometown in New Orleans, how, as the scholar Saidiya Hartman says, the afterlife of slavery shapes the landscape of our social, political, and economic infrastructure. And was thinking about that in New Orleans, but then sort of broadened it out to think about the entire country. And one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Monticello, which is the first chapter where I examine the life of Jefferson and the history of Jefferson as an enslaver, but also the enslaved people there, is I was curious how does Monticello as an institution give a more holistic sense of who Jefferson was than they may have given 10, 20, 30 years ago? And to what extent is that institution also giving us a sense of who the enslaved families who lived on that plantation were, besides Jefferson's own family, like the Hemmingses, the Fawcett's, the Grangers, these folks who built that land, who cultivated that land, who made memories and had families on that land, who in many ways who that land belonged to more than it belonged to Jefferson, given that Jefferson was away for extended periods of time in DC, in Philadelphia, in New York City, in Paris, with his various roles in the US government. And, Jefferson is interesting because on the one hand, I think he represents and sort of personifies the cognitive dissonance of America, in which America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here and one over here. They are deeply entangled in one another. And I think Jefferson, similarly, is someone who wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. And so when I think about that passage about Phillis Wheatley, when he says, basically, like, Phillis Wheatley is not, he's like, we could call that something else, but we can't call it poetry, because Black people don't possess the emotional capacity or the artistic bandwidth with which to create art. So he was like, we can call it something else, but we can't call it poetry because Wheatley doesn't possess, her work is below the dignity of criticism, as he put it. It wasn't even worth engaging with because Black people don't know what love is, and love is necessary in order to create poetry. And so for me, it was a moment to sort of step back and say, well, what a narrow conception of what one's idea of love is, right? And what a reductive notion of like what care and tenderness, and to your point, ultimately what justice look like. And I think for me, the way that all of this is tied to your work, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that I was writing a book about the public history and slavery, and how slavery is embodied in our public consciousness of the country, and also at the same time writing a book on children who were sentenced to life without, or a dissertation about children who were sentenced to life without parole. On the surface, they might not be in conversation with one another, but they very much are, in the sense that so much of the work that you all do at the CFSY is understanding the way that narratives shape public policy, and the way that narratives shape the legislation that folks are trying to enact. So much of what you are fighting against is narratives of super predators, narratives of danger, narratives of the omnipresent threat of violence from Black children looming at every corner. And so part of the work is both legislative and policy oriented, but it goes hand in hand with a sort of larger narrative recalibration and a sort of larger narrative interrogation to say, like, well, what are the stories that we have been told that created mass incarceration in the first place? What are the stories that are told about Black children, about brown children, about Indigenous children, that make it so that someone can even conceive of the idea that putting a child in prison for the rest of their lives is aligned with any notion of justice that we believe in? And it's a very specific set of stories that we tell that are impossible to disentangle from the history of slavery, in ways that, you know, ultimately, when you study the history, it becomes clear why we are the only country in the world that sentences children to life without parole, and how it's tied to the insidiousness of the story we have told about Black people generation after generation after generation.
Certainly. I definitely appreciate the contextualization, both in terms of Jefferson and all of the contradiction and complexity there that led up to your observations, and the way that you spoke and articulated all of these instances of love, right? Demonstrating the capacity to love, which isn't just about love itself, but it's also in ways demonstrating the fullness of your humanity that obviously wasn't recognized in ways that came out in Jefferson and others that you write about in the book. However, there's some things that I want to unpack and hone in on. And so you spoke to narratives as being one thing, the monuments that pay homage to the things that we hold important, dear, and that we value in our lives, and the need to deconstruct, particularly those monuments that are rooted in the oppression of other people. And you give the example also of the super predator narrative as a type of monument that also holds up this idea or this notion of the implicit savagery of Black children. And I want to go back to this notion of love, the opposite of being hate. And what drives love, what really makes love come alive, isn't so much the passions, but it's the value that we attach to the thing that we love. And I think that gets to the heart, to the essence of what the problem is, what our experience as African Americans in this particular country has been. Certainly, there's not been a lot of love demonstrated, expressed towards our community. But I think that's a reflection because there was no value that was attached to our very essence, to our right to being. And so while narrative has its place, it's the values that drive the narrative.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering, as that, what are your reflections in when we're bringing this to this place of truth-telling, liberation, that's also wrapped up in narratives that we tell to one another, but also how we reimagine and retell stories that isn't just about humanizing people who are already human, but it's this thing about having value, right? And so what is the narrative that your book tells or seeks to tell that demonstrates the value that we have as a people, and why children in particular?
Yeah. No, I appreciate
Yes.
that framing. I think part of what the the book is trying to do a couple of things. And so part of what I'm attempting to do is to give us and give the reader a sense of our collective proximity, our collective physical proximity to this history. And so, you know, part of what I want people to recognize is not only the 8 or 9 places that I go in the book, you know, that shape, you know, or that not only are these 8 or 9 places doing work to, or failing to do work that, you know, reckon with this history. And I wrote about 9 places, but it could have been about 100,009. Because the landscape, the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape everywhere in this country. But part of what happened was that in establishing for myself a sense of my own physical proximity to this history, I gained a deeper sense of our temporal proximity to this history, which is to say that, you know, standing inside of a slave cabin gives you that enslaved people once lived in, like I did at the Whitney in Louisiana. There's a different sort of visceral reaction that happens in your body, right? Just to hear the way the wood moans under your feet when you step inside, to feel the wind blowing through the cracks in the wood panels, and to think about how susceptible to the elements these families would have been, to see the sort of like hints of light shine through cracks in the roof. I mean, it gives you a sense of how, it gives you a deeper and more acute sense of how these folks live. And part of what it does then is remind me how the story we tell ourselves was so long ago isn't in fact that long ago at all. Right? Slavery existed in this country for 250 years. There's only not existed for about 150. And so you have an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't. You have an institution in which I think all the time about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great granddaughter. She was the daughter of someone born into intergenerational chattel bondage. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I am again reminded that this history that we tell ourselves is a long time ago wasn't that long ago at all. And so all of that together gives me a sense of the idea that someone would suggest that history, which we are only a few generations removed from, in which there are people who are alive today who loved, who were raised by, who were in community with people who were born into slavery, into chattel bondage. The idea that we would suggest that has nothing to do with what our political, social, and economic systems look like. That it has nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality look like. That it would have nothing to do, that it would not inform what our prison system looks like, what our criminalization system looks like. The idea that we can disentangle those things and that they have nothing to do with one another, that this thing is over here and this thing is over there, it is profoundly morally and intellectually disingenuous. And so the narrative of this book is hopefully a reminder of our proximity to this history, so that we can disabuse ourselves of this idea that this history has nothing to do with the society that we live in today, that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but it's because of what has been done to those communities, generation after generation after generation. And, you know, my book is about slavery, but like, it doesn't even account for 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. It doesn't even account for decades of redlining and state-sponsored housing segregation. It doesn't even begin to account for a history of school segregation and how entire school systems shut down after Brown v. Board rather than having Black children integrate them. I think about Prince Edward County in Virginia. Right? I mean, this is the context that shapes how and informs how we can make sense of how this country is understood, who Black children are and what Black children do or don't deserve. Because this country has said over and over again, Black children don't deserve an education. We rather shut down this whole school district than allow Black children to come in. Black children don't deserve houses in nice neighborhoods to live in. We're gonna, implement redlining so that the government and these banks don't give you the loans you need to move to a better neighborhood, and then blame you when you are trapped in neighborhoods that are saturated with poverty and violence. And so it is the insidiousness of doing things over and over again to create the conditions that create the despair and desperation and trauma that lead to someone becoming entangled in the criminal legal system. And then once they are entangled in it, then blaming them and saying that it's their fault. And that is the story of this country over the last few centuries.
Indeed. So interesting reflections and remarks. You what you speak to is this linear idea of the Middle Passage and the slavery experience and post-emancipation going into Jim and Jane Crow, Black codes and segregation. And if you follow the timeline leading right up to mass incarceration. And so if you think of these systemic issues and disadvantage purposely visited upon free Blacks, particularly in the South, but all across the country. And we look at 65 Civil Rights Act meant to give civil rights to human beings, which literally was just yesterday. And you still talk about redlining and disadvantage and what we see in terms of racial and ethnic disparities that exist within the criminal justice system or the legal system. You're suggesting there's never been a break in the chain of oppression that African Americans have experienced in this country. But you'll have those who don't understand that linear connection and say that was so long ago. Or they'll look to the likes of Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama, Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. And these pillars demonstrate that oppression isn't real. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The meritocracy argument. Black people are overrepresented in prison. Black children are overrepresented in children and sentenced to life without possibility of parole because they commit the crimes. How do we interpret? How do we unpack that?
I mean, I think part of what we have to understand is that there are systems and structures in place that are directly born out of the centuries-long project of slavery. So it might be helpful if I talk about another place that I visited in the book, Angola Prison, which I think speaks to the relationship of the past and present directly. So Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a foreign plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany, and the largest maximum security prison in Germany was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish. That place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States because it was put in place specifically to, as the state legislature in Louisiana in the 19th century said itself, to perpetuate and extend the power of white supremacy, so that you could have one or two Black jurors on the jury, but still convict someone who was Black to keep them involved and entangled in the criminal legal system, to keep them entangled in the convict leasing system. And you have all these folks, and you're working in these fields of what was once plantation, being watched by someone on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And so part of what I'm thinking about when I go to Angola is like, what is the way that a history of white supremacy not only acts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violences that in another global context would very clearly and understandably be unacceptable. And what does it mean that that place is not at all invested in to this point, or engaging in the project of like interrogating and exploring and excavating its own relationship to this history, even when that history is still so omnipresent in the landscape, right? Even when you literally have people working in fields, picking crops for virtually no pay. I remember when I was there with some of you might be familiar with Norris Henderson, who spent 30 years in Angola. And we were there at Angola together, and we were in this place, and we were watching as we were leaving. We saw these men sort of in the distance who were like raising their garden hose, putting them in the soil, raising their shovels, putting them in the soil, raising their spades, putting them in the soil. This guard watching over them on horseback, shotgun over their shoulder. And Norris was looking at the men, was looking at his hands, and his hands still have the calluses on them from when he used to work in these same fields. And he was like, Clint, I can't explain to you what it felt like to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour in fields where my ancestors very well may have picked cotton 200 years ago. And like that is the context of today. I mean, that's 2021. That's today. There are people who are doing that today, thousands of people. This place has a gift shop. This place has a gift shop where you can buy coffee mugs and shot glasses and sweatshirts and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb, and sweatshirts that have the silhouette of a watchtower and say Angola, a gated community, as if to make a mockery of the thousands of people who live there. And so again, to connect it to the work that you all do, you can't disentangle the fact that Henry Montgomery has been in that prison for over 50 years from the fact that that prison has coffee mugs that are making a joke of the circumstances of the people who are inside of it, from the fact that that land that Henry Montgomery and so many others are on is land that enslaved people worked on, that those men now work on for pennies on the hour. And so this is all, it is all connected. And we have to, and we cannot, and what you all do so beautifully is recognize that, like, we can't do the work of, you can't understand this only in its contemporary context. Like, you have to understand where it originates from. You have to understand where it comes from. You have to understand the way that it's part of a larger ecosystem of social, political, and historical factors that make it so that we have thousands of children in this country who are still in prison after being sentenced as children. That we still have states across this country that are willing to put a child in prison and tell them that they will never get out. The connection is a profound one and a deeply unsettling one.
Indeed, appreciate it. And so, yeah, so let's dig in a little bit. What you hear, and it's kind of what you pointed out in your book, right, about this cognitive dissonance, right, where clearly reflected in Jefferson's thought and the thought of, but we could also bring this up into the 21st century, particularly whether it be around the super predator narrative or this narrative that this country tells itself about Black youth in particular, Black and brown youth in particular. And then in the same way, it was thought then that there's this inability for Black folk to conceptualize the meaning of love. Those assumptions about Blackness, those assumptions about Black youth being particularly brutal, particularly violent, this inability to show remorse or regret, the inability to transform, being incorrigible and irredeemable. These particular narratives that make it easier for laws to exist, first of all, that hyper penalizes Black and brown youth, but also this thing that they are discardable, right? They have no value to society. And in the same way that you debunk that myth by just giving various demonstrations, including your own, of your capacity not only to love, but to write poetry in a meaningful way. The same way my existence here as a former life sentence child who has served 31 years before changing United States Supreme Court precedent that enabled me to be released in 2017. The expectation was that I too was a throwaway child, no redeemable qualities, and deserved to be disappeared from society and live the rest of my life in prison. Fortunately, that wasn't the case for me. There's many of my colleagues who that still is their fate as of this day. Not any less undeserving than myself, but this quality of redemption, this ability, when given a chance and an opportunity, to demonstrate the fullness of my humanity. And many of my colleagues who have since been released, both here in Pennsylvania and across the country, many of whom are in our Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. There's this constant display of just how wrong the narratives that we told ourselves about this youth, the children that we incarcerated, is on display every day in acts of charity and acts of kindness, in the most inspirational acts of love, right? Not just for self and community, but love for humanity. And the essence of what I'm getting to is that it is this thing about love, what love looks like in public, being justice. Love is what's centered in our values, or our values should be centered in love. You don't have to love me as an individual, but if you have a love for humanity, then that necessitates something.
And if you see that we are the same, right? Like if you see, if you see me in you, if you see your children in my children, if you see, absolutely. Because that's like you're speaking so beautifully to that. So often what is the disconnect is like is a profound, because tied to love is empathy, right? Absolutely. Like if absolutely. You are able to imagine yourself in someone else's circumstances, if you are able to imagine that who you are is not singularly tied to, the things that you have done yourself. I mean, part of what working in prisons as an educator taught me was that, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, it very easily could have been me, inside absolutely. Of a prison instead of somebody walking in and out of one. Absolutely. And that allowed me to more fully see myself in people who are incarcerated, people living in certain conditions, because I know that, but for the family I was born into, but for the parents, but for a range of circumstances beyond my control, it could have been so different. And so I think that it's both humility and empathy that animate and shape our understanding of love, right? Because that's, I think we can love someone in a different way when we can see that that could have been, especially someone who is experiencing difficult circumstances, when we know and we understand that that very easily could have been us.
Absolutely, absolutely. What would you speak about here? The importance of proximity, and I know that's one of the clarion calls for Brian Stevenson of what it means to be a change agent. That you do get proximate to life's problems, right? Those troubled areas, and that the willingness to change the narrative, right, about who we are, what our history has been in this country. And he also beckons us to remain hopeful, to have this hope that we can, in fact, transform our society and our conditions. And then this willingness, excuse me, to do the uncomfortable thing, right? And all of those things are certainly important, and I agree with them. But this unwillingness to do, or excuse me, having the willingness to do the uncomfortable thing, right, is so poignant in this moment right now, where a lot of folks feel uncomfortable. There's a lot of angst around race theory and a whole host of things. And what does it mean to stand in this uncomfortable moment and to reckon with what we have to reckon with in order to move forward as a country? And so in that spirit, and the subchapter of your book about what it means to reckon, I want to take a few minutes, if I can, and revisit a very poignant moment, I think, that you also mentioned in your book, and you could give us the context about your grandmother, your grandparents, and as you are sharing a conversation about what you're learning through your journey, and her retort, "I lived it, I lived it, I lived it." And you can give us the context of that, but the portion that I would like to read to set up both your thoughts around what reckoning means for us in this particular time. You say that the history of slavery is the history of the United States. It was not peripheral to our founding, it was central to it. It is not irrelevant to our contemporary society, it created it. This history is in our soil, it is in our policies, and it must too be in our memories. What do you mean by that?
I should say also that if people have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll we'll do our best to get to them. But given that we're getting close, you know, for me, I'd spent this book, you know, and these years talking to strangers and asking them questions about their lives and their relationship to this history. And I got to a point where I realized that I had never been nearly as intentional about asking these sorts of questions to my own family as I was in asking them to a bunch of strangers. And so there was a moment where my grandparents came to visit here in Washington, D.C., and we were walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I'm pushing my grandfather, born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi, in his wheelchair. My grandmother, born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida, is walking ahead of us. And we're walking through this museum. And I kind of was watching them look at the exhibits and engage with them, you know, went through the Emmett Till exhibit with my grandfather, who said after we left it, he was like, you know, your grandmother and I lived only a few miles from where this happened. That I realized that so much of the history documented in this museum was stuff that my family and my grandparents had experienced firsthand. And there, it's kind of like I said before, you know, I was like, wow, my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. My proximity to this history is close, but their proximity to it is profoundly close. And my grandmother, when I asked her about it afterwards, as you alluded to, she was like, I was like, well, what was that? What was it like being in that museum? And she was like, I lived it. But this was her, this was real. This was her. This wasn't a black and white documentary. This wasn't something in the textbook. This was her life. This were the things that people talk about as being reflective of the worst that this country has ever done. Among the worst that this country has ever done are things that she lived through. Little white kids were riding the school bus down the road and throwing ice cream and rocks and spitting at her and her siblings while they walked to school on these sort of red clay dirt roads in Florida. She went to segregated schools. She rode on segregated buses. She sat in segregated movie theaters. That was her life. That's the life of so many people that we know and love, right? Millions of people in this country today. And it's just so important for us not to fall into the trap of thinking that was a long time ago. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic earlier this year about how so many of the people who made Georgia turn blue, so many of the Black folks who allowed Georgia to elect 2 Democratic senators, are people who, when they were born, weren't allowed to vote at all in that country, in that state, the state that initiated poll tax, right? And now it's those Black folks who once were not allowed to vote in their lifetime, who are now voting to make it so that they are transforming the political landscape of Georgia and thus the country. So it's we're just, I keep saying it over and over in different ways, but we're so close to this history, so close in the context of human life, in the context of human history. This was just yesterday. It wasn't a long time ago at all.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things as we begin to wrap up here is it was almost a visceral experience. I lived it. And I couldn't help but think about my own lived experience and being condemned as a child, 17-year-old child, with the expectation of dying in prison and sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And all of the degradation that went along with that, just the sheer brutality, not just of the sentence and the indefinite amount of years that I will have to languish in prison, but the brutality of the environment, the harshness of the shrillness of the sounds that you hear therein, the physical violence that your eyes witness. And I wish we had time to go into the detail of what the experience is, because it's the sentence, but it's not just the sentence, right? It's the conditions of confinement. It's what it does to the human spirit, right? It's what it means to live in a state of desperation and despair and hopelessness. It's the loss of loved ones and not being able to mourn. It's the inability to hug a loved one. It's the inability to perceive and witness the beauty in life. It's the inability to show up and be helpful in the lives of the people who mean the most to you. There's so much more than just the sentence that in some ways is the same amount of dishonor and despair that you could imagine people who have experienced slavery, people who have experienced the harshness of the oppression of Jim and Jane Crow and segregation and the violence of white supremacy. That there are certain similarities in terms of experience and what it does to the spirit and the soul that we certainly can talk about and get into. But I don't want to leave on that note. I want to leave on a note of hopefulness, right? Because yes, I lived it, and there is far too many children who are still living it today as we speak. But what is our reckoning? What is if there's a word that you could advise us around what it means to reckon not just with our historic experience here in America, but in the present day reality, what does it mean to come to a reckoning, as your book advises?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, it's really simple. I mean, we just have to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth, and we have to establish, there's more conversation now than there's ever been about reparations. And reparations, I think it's important to notice not only the reallocation of material resources and material capital, but it's the repair of memory, right? It's like creating a collective consciousness of information and facts and history from which we are all able to make an informed set of decisions. And that's, we all have a role to play in this work in all sorts of ways. And part of what I hope to do in my own work is to inform and give us a sense of how to lean more fully into our history, and to hopefully establish establish the connective tissue that ties the present and the past together more fully and for more people. I know that we had a couple questions that came in, and I don't want people to feel like they asked and didn't get some answers, so I'm gonna hit them. My wife will tell you that I'm notoriously long-winded, so I'm gonna try to hit them with the lightning fire. So I thought your book was brilliant and beautiful. Thank you. I know you spoke a bit about the connections between your research and your dissertation and research for this book. For me, in reading the Angola chapter in particular, I highlighted the historical origins of mass incarceration and the impact on people like Henry Montgomery, who are still there today. I don't know if you were able to meet Mr. Montgomery. I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about your visit to Angola and how your LWOP work was informed by your perspective there. Thank you, Ria, for that question. I mean, I could have written a whole book about Angola and what that experience was like there. I mean, so many people on this call have been. I have not had the opportunity to meet Mr. Montgomery myself. But I think that for me, and this is true of Angola, it's true of all these places, like it's one thing to understand it in the abstract, but like when you go to Angola and you see how vast it is, and you stand on that land, and you see these men in these fields, and you talk to these men who've been there for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years on a former plantation. I mean, the stakes just are like exponentially higher. You're like, I cannot believe we do this to people. I can't believe we keep people here. I can't believe that this place is allowed to exist on this land or at all. And so I think for me, it just made it, that's why I go to places. I mean, that's why, the journalist in me, like, that's why I have to do this on the ground reporting, because I need to go there and I need to see it and smell it and touch it to say, like, this is horrible. And I hope to Abdullah's point that he was making earlier, when you talk about I lived it, I hope that my children, are lucky enough years from now to have a conversation with you, and that they live in a world in which life without parole doesn't exist. And that they can talk to Uncle Abdullah and say, and that you can say, like, I lived that. And that they're like, I can't believe we ever did that. Right? That's what I want for my kids, is I want them to live in a world where they're like, I can't believe we ever thought it was okay to put children in prison for at all, or for the rest, much less for the rest of their lives. So Angola made it very real. Shima is asking, given all the monuments, museums, landmarks, and so on that Clint visited as part of his research, did a framework or approach to reading those symbols or representations emerge? Are there competencies or literacy that emerge for reading and taking in the representations and symbols of our national memory that you could share? A framework. I don't know that there's a specific framework, as much as it just reflected the inconsistency and heterogeneity of the way that our national memory is curated, right? I mean, like, you have some places like Blandford, which are not at all engaged in the project of reckoning with its history in an honest way. And you have places like the Whitney, which are, as I describe in the book, attempting to unbend 4 centuries of cricket nails. and attempting to tell a story in a way that it should have always been told, but in a way that has not been told. And this place that's surrounded by a constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings and formal ceremonies, where people still use the former slave cabins as bridal suites. Like those are the stakes. And so I think I didn't have a framework as much as I just went into each place curious to understand how they told the story and realize that our country is so vast, our sensibilities are so different, and the story is told in so many different ways. And if I could write How the Word is Passed part 2, 3, 4, 5, I think it would reflect the same thing. So I think we're running out of time, and this is why me and Abd'Allah had a 4-hour conversation the first time. Going on and go on and on.
Yeah, no, thank you so much to both of you. I wish we had, yes, all the time in the world. I would sit here and continue to listen. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that you two rooted a conversation about our long history of racism in a lens of love. And that really speaks to the two of you. To the people that you are, to an incredible generosity that you brought to this conversation. And I'm just so grateful. What a gift that is to all of us. And before we close out, I do have another gem from Clint's book that I want to share with folks that really stuck out to me as I read it this summer. And it's in the chapter about Galveston Island, about Juneteenth. Clint writes, Juneteenth is a reminder that each day this country must consciously make a decision to move toward freedom for all its citizens. That this is something that must be done proactively. It will not happen on its own. The project of freedom, Juneteenth reminds us, is precarious. And we should regularly remind ourselves how many people who came before us never got to experience it. And how many people are still waiting. So if you were moved by anything you heard from Clint and Abd'Allah, who just shared so generously with us today, I invite you to decide now what action you will take to ensure that the project of freedom is realized. It's on all of us, and most especially people who look like me, those of us who've benefited from our country's long history of racism. We have a responsibility to do this work. We all have a role to play. The good news is we have very concrete things everyone on this webinar can do to get engaged. Read the book. If you've read it, get it for a friend, preferably from a Black-owned or independent bookstore. And after today's conversation, the CFSY will be sending out an email to everyone who's participated with 5 ways you can take action to advance our efforts at the CFSY, including signing a petition for Henry Montgomery, who you heard about earlier, who's served more than 57 years in prison for a crime he committed at age 17, and he's incarcerated there at Angola Prison. We want to see him freed, and you can help us get there. We also welcome support for the work that we're doing. We'll send you information about how to stay in touch, get involved. And I just want to say thank you again to Clint and Abd'Allah for your work, for your ongoing efforts, for continuing this conversation. Thanks to everybody who came and joined us today. I encourage you to leave this conversation inspired to find one way that you can bring us a step closer to our collective healing and liberation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.